learners, and welcome to the course on tribes of northern and northeastern region of India. And today we will start with block 3, which is unit 3 from BSW 044. The title of the topic is Displacement and Migration of Tribals. However, we will take these two topics differently. First we'll deal with displacement and then we'll go ahead with migration. Before we go further, I would like to give you the objective of this course. Displacement and migration are two major sociological phenomena. By the end of the session, you are expected to have an understanding of displacement and its implications, primarily for the marginalized communities who completely depend on their land for livelihood. Secondly, the need of a comprehensive rehabilitation policy in the country would be understood by you. Thirdly, this session would also help you to understand migration and its various kinds, and the relationship between displacement and migration will also be discussed. Now, let me introduce what we are supposed to do. It is important that we briefly understand before we go ahead what we mean by displacement and migration. Displacement is more than physical dislocation. It is being uprooted and dismemberment of the socio-economic webs of life with traumatic experiences. However, these experiences could be traumatic as well as non-traumatic as well, depending on the situation and the kind of displacement. But usually when the word displacement is used, it is accompanied with more of a traumatic experiences. Now it results into a spiral of impoverishment. Displacement threatens the existence and identity of people. There is a process of dispossession in displacement. It is also estimated that in the last 65 years after independence of India, there are more than 60 to 70 million displaced persons in the country. Now, according to a study, it is also estimated that about 24% of the displaced are rehabilitated and more than 75% are left in the lurch, which means we have only around 24 to 25% that are rehabilitated, and majority of them are not rehabilitated and live an impoverished life. There is also an interrelation between displacement and migration. Having said so, let us understand what does migration means. Migration is not a new phenomenon and it is not going to end in the near future. Migration has been going on since time immemorial. Ever since the existence of humanity, human beings have been and are still migrating. Existing anthropological and archaeological literature indicates that the early human beings migrated from one place to another for security, sustenance, and stability, among many other reasons. Now, in various periods in the history of mankind, ranging from the Vedic period through the colonial period to the contemporary times, migrations in varying degree has been taking place. In the contemporary world, the phenomenon of migration has been quite common. Now, having understood or defined the term displacement and migration, let us now understand displacement in a little bit more detail. The history of Indian economic and industrial development is a never-ending story of displacement of people. A few years ago, available reports indicated that more than 21 million people were internally displaced due to development projects in India. Like India is a developing country, and so we have lots of projects which are necessary for the development of the country as well. But at the same time, when these alternative policies are not in place, what happens is the people in the area, the project area, becomes displaced. Now, although they only make about 8% of the total population, more than 50% of the displaced were tribal people. Now, until 1990, about 85.39 lakhs tribals had reportedly been displaced due to industrialization and development projects like dams, power projects, nature conservation, etc. And their rehabilitation and resettlement always remained a neglected subject. Promises were given, but nothing happened. So this is an ongoing cycle where the development has to take place, People have to be displaced, they have to be rehabilitated, but then what happens in reality is a different story altogether. Now, for example, if I have to explain this aspect, tribals constituted 8.2% of the total population of India according to 2011 census. But they also constituted 55.1% of the total displaced persons as a result of so-called development projects. So, which is quite a huge amount. Now, these figures have gone much higher now and it needs to be updated. Now, development according to Constitution is that process of governance which, while respecting human rights of all persons, secures to all Indians freedom from material impoverishment. Bakshi believes that in the planning process in India, the spirit of the Constitution has been betrayed. People are no partners in the process of decision making regarding the constructions of dams, the size, the areas of submergence, environment impact, cost-benefit analysis, allocations of resources. It could be designs including safety designing, epidemiological impact analysis, contracts for construction, flow of benefits to certain classes or sectors, displacement, and even the rehabilitation policies. So people are not a part of the decision-making process. Now, all these are considered to be the domain of the administration. Development should have been a more representative character, which means the people where the projects are about to happen, where the development projects are to be taken place, the people have to be a part of the decision-making process. Now, there should be a people-oriented development, and involuntary relocation of sites of community existence is always problematic as the consequent dislocation of human being is much too high. Land Acquisition Act 1894 talks of public purposes and compensation for acquisition of land. But when whole villages are submerged, people who have no land are also displaced at the same time. And money compensation is one component, but not necessarily the most decisive one of rehabilitation. Because if you give money as compensation, well, it works for some time, but then it is not always, as we say, sustainable. So one has to think of a rehabilitation policy which is sustainable to this displaced people. Now, we've talked a lot about the displaced people because of the development projects and all. Now, let us understand about the affected people or the displaced people. It is important to ask what and how of displacement. But more important is the question why and whose. Because displacement is a process where poorer sections are pushed out of their own habitat. In situations where the marginalized people have no other choice but move from their own village or place of origin to other place, the local inhabitants lose their command over the resources because obviously they are displaced. Now, given the number of displacements, types of displacement, and the plight suffered by the displaced, many are now asking, whose nation is it? Because they are being displaced, they are being impoverished, they have no say in the resources, they have no say in the decision making. So whose good is being served? Is it for the planners, the administrators, implementing agencies, or upper middle class or marginalized sections of the society? Planners and administrators invariably capitalize on and manipulate the relatively weaker socio-economic and political position of the displaced persons. Their numbers definitely are underestimated. They are treated indifferently and only minimal cash compensation, if at all, is paid to them. And like we said before, cash payment as a rehabilitative policy or as a compensation is not adequate because this is not sustainable. So one has to think of a sustainable effort. Now, they are rarely granted security of tenure or alternative developed land. And this is the problem. If you give them land or if you give them other source of income or livelihood, probably that would have been more sustainable. Now, often after a painful and traumatic period of establishing a new lifestyle, they are again informed. they must move again to make way for yet another project. So they are living a nomadic life, or in fact you could say they are migrating. Although they are displaced, in a certain sense they are also migrating from one place to another, to another, to another, and so on. Now, apart from the immediate economic loss, displacement also brings about social, cultural, and psychological dislocation. The physical displacement of the people leads to their uprooting from their socio-cultural base, which is no less pathetic than the disposition of land. They lose their traditional mechanism of social control, and as a result, social tensions increases among them. Going towards the tribals, the history of the tribals has been one of displacement without rehabilitation. If the history of Jharkhand is traced in the Muslim, British, and post-colonial periods, one is amazed as to how involuntary displacements have taken place down the centuries with no rehabilitation or without adequate rehabilitation. Having said so, many of you would be saying, why not ask the government? But one of the excuses by various governments is that there is no policy on rehabilitation. Nevertheless, what is a matter of grave concern is the attitude of partisanship to a few haves at the cost of the have-nots. So, definitely always the battle between the haves and the have-nots. It is precisely this approach that is discriminatory against the weaker section, especially the tribals. Now, the alienation of land was one of the main reasons of the many tribal uprisings all over the country. In the year 1793, the British passed the Permanent Settlement Act to get as much revenue from land as possible. Now, this act, common in Bengal, Awadh and Madras presidencies, gave zamindars absolute proprietary right on land. There were middlemen created to collect revenues from their respective areas. Therefore, water, land, and forests, till now considered being community-owned natural resources, became private property of individual owners. The new landed class was naturally happy with the new arrangements, since it enabled them to establish recorded rights over land. So far, there was no ownership of the land, but only the right of revenue collection. Since land ownership was considered to be private, the state could collect revenue from these lands, but it could not take over the land as and when it desired again. So what happens is, on the other hand, there was an increasing need for land for railways, roads, other government projects, for forest produce to support the British industries in the name of development. It was to establish rights over the ownership of land that the British created the Land Acquisition Act in the year 1894. Now, what happens, or what does this act do? This act facilitated the British control by destroying local people's right over the country's natural resources. The Draconian Act of 1894 continued till as recently as 1984, when few amendments were made. So, land is scarce to the tribals because that is the only source they have for their sustenance. About 70% of India's population, most of whom are tribals, primarily depend on land-related work and agricultural productions. Thus, land for the tribals is a means of livelihood and the basis of socio-economic relationship, and they have a lot to do with land. Alienation from land and displacement have threatened the livelihood of millions, not only the tribals. People are displaced without any consultation or participation in the development process. Furthermore, what happens is they are denied their rightful share in the gains of the development projects that displaces them. A very large number of the displaced people belong to the scheduled caste as well as the scheduled tribes, and women are the worst sufferers. Moreover, rehabilitation is still not an integral part of the displacement plan or any displacement plan. Now, having talked so much about displacement and the scheduled castes and the scheduled tribe people who are affected, and the women are also affected majorly because of their vulnerability, let us look at the concept of displacement and livelihood. Victims of displacement are deprived of compensation for the loss of their land because they do not possess any documents to claim that the land indeed belongs to them. Moreover, even if the land does belong to them or the lost land belongs to them, tribals' dependence on forests, land, river and other natural resources sustain them. So if they are expropriated their support system, it is also eroded again. So hence, there is an adverse impact of displacement on tribals, and with this comes the adverse effect on their livelihood. Now, negative impacts of globalization and industrialization through the corporate are affecting the tribal and other deprived communities across the country, especially those located in the tribal areas. These communities are being threatened with massive mining, industrialization, hydro projects leading to large-scale displacement. Now, if you talk about all these aspects, we've heard of the social worker Medha Patkar, who had been a staunch supporter of the displaced people, and the Narmada Bachao Andolan. All these are also talking about the rehabilitative right of the displaced people. So this is one example you could talk about it. Now, these regions are also a homeland of large number of tribal and the so-called primitive tribal groups. Now, the survival rights of these groups related to food and livelihood and customary practices reflecting the community's identity goes beyond the state administrative boundary. The recent development interventions have led to major setback for the existence of all these people, threatening their very survival. Now, with this, I would like to cut short the class and sum up what we did in this session so that we are able to talk about more of displacement in the next session. Now, before we end, let us sum up what we did. We defined displacement as a process of being uprooted and dismemberment of the socio-economic webs of life with experiences which could be traumatic and non-traumatic as well, but mostly for the displaced people it becomes a traumatic experiences. We also discussed about displacement and highlighted that the tribals form approximately around 55.1% of the total displaced persons as a result of so-called development projects. Now, having said so, these figures would have gone much higher now when there are more of development projects happening, and it could be updated. Now, we also emphasize when talking about displacement on asking certain questions related to what and how of displacement. But most important is the question of why the displacement has to happen and whose displacement has to happen. Is it only the have-nots, or is it only the poorer section of the society? And why does it have to happen? Could it not be traced back to other areas? Why only the areas where there are poor section of the people? So these are some of the critical questions as a learner or as a student you could ask yourself, and even ask whatever aspect happens when you talk about displacement. Now, this is also important, like as we mentioned, why and whose displacement. It is important to question because displacement is a process where poorer sections are pushed out of their own habitat. So whenever we talk of displacement, we just hear that the poorer section of the people are mostly affected. Now, we also in this session touched upon the fact that a very large number of the displaced people belong to the scheduled caste, and the scheduled tribe, and women being vulnerable are also the worst sufferers. And unfortunately, rehabilitation in terms of during displacement is not an integral part of the displacement plan. And we also briefly discussed about displacement and how it impacts on the livelihood, especially of the tribal population. Now, we shall continue more on the issues related to displacement in the next session. I do hope you all had a good learning experience and are able to understand the minute or the characteristic feature of what a displacement is. Thank you.